here. So the cicada. So I'm Dave, by the way, and I'm the beekeeper here at Kemper House. And so I have an affinity for insects in general, mainly because I work for about 250 million of them out in the beehives. But I like all kinds of insects. And this year is a year that something called the 17-year cicada are emerging. And literally millions of them just coming up out of the ground. And you've probably heard it before, you know, if you grew up in this area, just that deafening roar of them. It hasn't hit here into Worthington and Columbus yet. But honestly, just 5 or 6 minute drive up the road, my parents live over in Westerville, and oh my goodness, their yard, you can't walk to the front door without a bunch of cicadas just landing all over. Wow. They're everywhere. My wife and I went to go visit my parents the other day, pulled up, then we opened the door and it was just like this. It was like a rock concert outside. It was so loud, it really was. So it's been quite something. Turn that off. Thought about it because I got a video on my phone.
Dave, you're all mic'd up and ready to go, my friend.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's get started. Well, thanks again for coming out on this Saturday morning, and we're going to learn more than you ever wanted to know about bees and honeybees. Greg, protocol for the mask if I'm speaking.
You can have it off.
Okay.
Yeah, from there, no problem.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm
vaccinated too, right?
I brought my stuff in to get it on file.
Awesome.
Yes. So I just want everybody to be able to hear me. Is that a little bit better that you can hear and understand me some more? Yeah. Excellent. Because I have disturbing things to tell you today about honeybees and honey. So we are going to talk about how honey is made. The last time I was here, we discussed swarming a little bit and how that is part of the reproductive cycle of honeybees. And that's me with one of my buddies. That's a bee colony. There's probably 30,000 individual honeybees in there. And there's another one. I'm like, who's the guy that stuck his thumb in the pie and pulled out a plum? What's his name? Jack something. Anyway. So last time we talked a little bit about honeybees and their life cycle and how they reproduce, sort of the birds and the bees. And today we're going to talk about what honeybees are most known for. Anyone want to guess what what honeybees are most known for? Honey. Honey. Exactly. Wait, that was an answer. You weren't just flirting with me or something, right? That was an answer. Okay, good. So we're going to talk about honey and how honey is made, what honey is, and since Greg's out of the room, I'll let you all in on a little secret. We're talking about how honey is made and how we harvest it from the bees, because next month, we're actually going to harvest honey from the bees right here in the back. We've got a bunch of beehives. We're going to steal that. Let's be honest, we're stealing their honey. We're not harvesting it, right? We're just taking it from them. And we're going to bring it in here and everybody will be able to help extract it, see that process, maybe even get some taste of fresh honey right out of the hive, okay? So what I want to do is talk a little bit about bees, honeybees, and what they are. So here's a picture of a young lady. Okay? All the bees in a honeybee colony that do any work are female. Okay? The males don't do any work. Yeah, no big surprise. Shocking, right? I know. Okay? The males have an important role. It's just, you know, it's not that important, I guess. But a few fundamentals about what a honeybee is and what a honeybee colony is. So I've got this picture of her here. Anybody got an idea what that is on her leg? Want to guess what that yellow stuff is? That is pollen. Okay? So honeybees actually collect pollen as their protein source, right? So if it's like a meat and potatoes kind of thing, that's the meat. So that's their protein. But I'm here to tell you that this isn't an animal. This isn't the animal that we think of as a honeybee, because honeybees are what we call a superorganism. So the animal is the whole colony when all 60,000 or more honeybees come together. So that's kind of the how I think of my honeybee colonies. So when somebody asks me how many bees are out back at Kemper House, I will say 9. And they're like, 9 honeybees? How are they going to make all that honey? Well, it's 9 honeybee colonies. A way to think about it is when you see a tree, all the little leaves on the tree are not individual plants, right? They're all part of a larger plant. Okay? So she's like one of the leaves on a tree. She helps bring the food in, because that's what leaves on a tree do, right? Is they photosynthesize and they create food for the tree. And so that's what worker bees do. Okay? Another really important thing that we're going to talk about and we're going to see a little bit of is comb. You guys have all heard of honeycomb, right? Or beeswax. I know, I remember the first time I ever heard of beeswax. It was my grandma, and she sat me down. I had a few questions for her, and she said, Dave, mind your own beeswax. Ever since then, I've just, my whole world knows. The wax is really important. In a way, I like to think of it, it's kind of like our skin is to us, right? Like our skin's really important. I, for one, never go anywhere without it, right? It sort of helps keep me together, keeps everything in its place, and that's kind of what comb or wax does, beeswax does within the hive. They store their food there, so it's kind of like when a honeybee colony gets bigger and bigger, it's putting on honey, it's kind of like getting fatter and fatter. They're storing food for later. We're going to talk about that more. It's also where they raise new bees as well. So wax is very important. They even communicate to each other through the wax. Honeybees live in a world that is all about smells. And so they have different parts of the colony have different smells so that they know where they are. Okay? When they do the waggle dance, they even put chemicals into the wax that make the wax smell. You know how you can get scented candles? Because candles, wax, are a type of fat, and fat holds on to other things really well. So things like smells. Greg had a question, yeah.
Yeah, so I had heard that for a honeybee to create wax, it's one of the most taxing things on a honeybee. So I know that a lot of beekeepers are not about giving out the honey or the wax comb itself.
Yeah, I get a lot of requests. People want to know if I just sell honeycomb, like I'll just cut some honeycomb, and that used to be a really popular way to sell it. I don't. Some beekeepers do, but they often charge a lot more, because in order to make a pound of wax, a honeybee colony has to consume like 8 to 10 pounds of honey. Wow. So when you look at the math, both for the honeybees and the beekeeper, it's better to just steal the honey and leave all the wax for the bees. And we're going to talk about how we do that.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, in July, we're actually going to see how we do that as well. Okay. Another thing, as I've mentioned a couple times, that wax is a type of fat, and it also helps to insulate the colony, especially during the winter. Okay. Here we go.
Wow.
So this is, when I look at this is more a picture of what a honeybee animal looks like, the colony. So here, we of course have our worker bees, right? They're all working. These colorful hexagons in here, that's pollen. So the honeybees, remember that first honeybee had that pollen on her leg. They bring it into the hive and they put it in there, and they put it right next to all the brood and eggs. Because this pollen is protein, It's really like super high charged baby formula, and they're gonna feed it. They actually raise their babies here. So there's a lot of honeybee larvae in here. They'll have to feed them some of this. The shiny stuff up here is honey as well, or nectar becoming ripened honey. And of course they feed that to the larva, and then all the adult bees eat honey as well. It's funny because a lot of times when I educate people about bees, it doesn't click that bees make honey because bees eat honey, right? We're actually stealing their food from them. In fact, when you think of the honeybee colony as an animal, it's kind of like we're going in and scooping out some of their fat reserves. And that's what we're spreading on our toasted biscuits. I told you I had disturbing things to tell you today, and it's only going to get worse. Okay. So this is sort of a look inside of a honeybee colony and what it looks like in the anatomy. And but let's talk about their diet. Honeybees are vegetarians. Okay? So they get all of their food from plants. And again, the pollen, they collect it on their legs right there. That's their protein source, so that's like their steak. And then they get nectar, which is sugar water. The trees produce sugar water, and they get that nectar, and they use that nectar to make honey. Okay? And then honey is their sugar source. We've all tasted honey, yes? Does anybody know? Okay. So we know how it's very, very sweet. Right?
Is there anybody here that doesn't like honey? Does everybody like honey? I think everybody does, so
Yeah.
Nobody's volunteering to say yay or nay, but I've never met anybody that didn't like honey.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's just so sweet that it's really a good thing. So remember earlier when I was talking about leaves on a tree, and they do photosynthesis, and what they're doing is they're turning sunlight energy into sugar so that the plant has energy to grow, because sugar is energy that we can use to grow. When they produce that sugar, they do it with a lot of water, because we all have, when we're growing plants, right, we have to water them to keep them healthy, because they mix it with that sugar, and that makes nectar. So nectar is the same food that plants make to eat, but it's also what bees use. It's the raw material bees use to make honey. On average, every plant is different, but on average, nectar is really mostly water. It's like 80% water or more. So when you would take, if you were to taste nectar from a plant, it wouldn't really taste super sweet. It might have just a little hint of sweetness to it. But honey is more than 80% sugars. So we're going to talk a little bit about how do bees take nectar from a plant and turn it into honey that we can steal, harvest from them, and bottle up and enjoy. Okay? Does that sound like a good thing to talk about today? Yes, excellent. Okay, so let's get into it. So here we are at the front of a hive. When this lady here collects this nectar out of this plant, and she can spend a long time, and she's going to visit several flowers, because every flower is really stingy. It just gives her a tiny little sip of nectar. So she has to fly to hundreds of flowers to get a full load of nectar that she can take back to the hive. When she comes back, her stomach is full of that sugar water, nectar. She can almost carry her own weight in nectar. So I would always tell, when I talk to elementary school kids, I'd always tell them, imagine walking home with your backpack, but you're carrying yourself in your backpack. You know, that's pretty heavy. So these little bees do a lot of great work. Here's the thing, remember how I said she has to visit hundreds of flowers to get a full stomach load of nectar to take back? That takes a lot of time, right? So when she comes back to the hive, she's like, I don't have time to go all the way in and put the groceries away, as it were, right? I know as a kid growing up, I always had to help my mom bring the groceries in from the car. She'd pull up the driveway, honk the horn, and that was like, time to come out, unload the car, get the groceries to the fridge. And that's what honeybees do, in a way. They don't honk the horn, they don't drive cars. They're too young, they never took the driver's test. But they do something called trophallaxis. Okay, we're getting we're getting into some of the really disturbing stuff here. Okay? So these two worker bees here, what happens is, if you look here, this is a diagram of the inside of a honeybee. And this big red circle there is the honeybee's stomach. They call it a honey stomach or a crop. And they'll put all the nectar that they collected from the plants into this stomach. And when they get back to the hive, instead of going and finding out where the fridge is, where they need to put those groceries they collected, they find one of their sisters who isn't collecting nectar. And they say, hey, I've got all of these groceries. Will you go put them away for me? And she's like, sure. I don't have any bags, though. How am I going to carry it? No worries. We'll just do some prophylaxis. Okay. What that means is she empties the contents of her stomach into her sister's stomach. So the way we would think about it is she throws up all the stuff that she collected, and her sister basically slurps all that stuff that she throws up, puts it in her stomach, and then that bee will take it and put it in the honeycomb. I know, I see the look on your face. I'm disgusted too. Right? It's actually a really interesting process, and we can see it here. And it's not just one bee to one bee. Look at these ladies over here. See those little stripes there? Those are their tongues sticking out. So one honeybee is opening its mouth, and they're coming up and just eating all the, if you've had a puppy, you know what it's like, or you've seen baby birds, right? It's the same kind of thing. Right? Here's one where you can really see their tongues. Right? It's like this sort of almost like translucent amber color. Really interesting stuff. And here's some more. And if you notice, their antenna as well. Their antenna, almost in all these pictures, their antenna are blurry because their antenna are constantly moving as they're passing the nectar from one bee to another. Their antennae are used to smell. So part of that is they're smelling each other to make sure they're actually sisters. Because you don't want to give away your food to somebody who's not related to you because they may never give it back, right? So that's just the bees working. That way, that forager who knows exactly where those flowers are already, she can go back and collect more nectar. So by doing this thing called prophylaxis, they're splitting up the jobs, and it means that they can actually make more honey than if they were working on their own. Okay? And I think that there's a lot of things in life that's true. That doing a job on your own will take a really long time and be hard, but if you've got a friend there helping you, or a sister, or a brother, well, in a bee's case, not a brother, because male bees don't do any work, right? So a sister. It makes the work go quicker, right? Much quicker. Here we go. Some more photos here. Look at that. You can really see their tongues there. They're just like almost translucent. You can almost see through their tongues if the sun shines on it just right. I know most people are really grossed out by insects and bugs, but to me, this is just absolutely beautiful, right? I spend way too much time with bees, right? So this is the main system by which they make honey. And we always say that bees make honey. I've said it a bunch of times today, and it's a perfectly valid way to think about it. But I want to suggest something else. Another way to think about it is the honeybees, by doing this, by passing the nectar from one honeybee to another, right? And if you remember, it goes from one stomach to another. What is in our stomachs? When we eat our food, what happens in our stomachs? There's lots of acids and enzymes and all these things that digest that food. Honeybees are just like us. In their stomachs, there's enzymes and acids that start digesting that nectar, okay? And part of the process of digesting nectar is getting rid of water. Okay? So they estimate that every drop of honey, more disturbing news, it's okay to plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. Every drop of honey, nectar that's collected from a plant passes through at least 6 honeybee stomachs before it becomes actual honey. Okay? I like to think of it, once a bee gets the nectar from a plant, I start calling it honey because it started the process of becoming honey. Just like this time of year, if you go out to the apple orchard, you'll see tiny little apples, okay? You know, we're not gonna call them not quite apples, becoming apples. I will call them apples, but they're not ripe. They need time to become ripe. Honey is the same way. The minute a bee takes nectar out of a plant, I like to think of it as becoming honey. So I call it honey. And then there's ripened honey when we get to, once it's actually ripe and ready to harvest. And when it's ripe and ready to harvest, that means it's actually edible to the bees. Yes.
Dave, is there any other insect in the world that creates something like honey?
There are. So that's a really good question. There's about 8 to 12 species of honeybee, of true honeybees. So they're the only ones that actually make something that we call honey, that is what we call shelf stable. That means honey never spoils. Never spoils. As long as you keep the lid on the jar, as long as it's sealed up, it will never spoil. And so there's only about eight species of insects that do that. Other animals though, bumblebees for example, they collect nectar and they'll store it, but they'll only store it for 3 to 4 days. And then it starts to spoil because they're not pre-digesting it like honeys do. There's aphids that produce something called honeydew. So aphids feed on plants. They're feeding on this, in fact, they're feeding on nectar. Just like honeybees. We'll go back to nectar. Back to this picture. So aphids actually feed on that same sugar water that plants produce. But aphids are so small and there's so much water. Remember I said in a plant, it's like 80% water. It's mostly water. So that's too much for the aphids to deal with. And so out their back end comes this stuff called honeydew. And there are ants that will harvest that, take it back to their nest, and then they actually use that to grow things like fungus. And then they eat the fungus. Like they're like ants, they're like, well, but they're just really patient. Like most people will be like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat this. They're like, no, I think I can use this as fertilizer and grow some nice mushrooms and we'll have, you know, maybe a little beef stroganoff or something like that for dinner. All right, one last picture here, one of my favorites. There we go. Look how hairy those bees are. Like seriously, they just won't shave in the morning.
Like you, Dave.
Right. Now you see why I like them so much, right? And if you notice, look right there. Those are hairs growing out of the honeybee's eyes. Okay. So they actually do have hairy eyes. But again, you can see, look at that tongue right there. And what they're doing is just passing. The trophallaxis is just a fancy word, as I like to tell the grade school kids, that means barf in your sister's mouth. Okay? What it actually means is to move by mouth. If you take I think it's Greek. It just means to move basically from mouth to mouth.
Elizabeth has sisters.
So it moves from mouth to mouth. They can also pass other chemicals. So like, remember I said that honeybees really communicate with each other. They live in a world of smells. And so different smells mean different things to them. And it's kind of like a language. So often, what some honeybees will do is they will actually lick the queen bee and get some of her smell off of her, like her perfume, and they'll feed it to the other bee. And that seems really strange. Like I would never go lick my mom and then spit that into my brother's mouth. Like that would be weird. But for honeybees, that's what they do. And it's their language. It's one honeybee telling another, hey, we have a queen in this colony. Guess how I know? Here, I actually licked her. And they're like, oh, wow, you really did lick her. And then it becomes a game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, where it's like, hey, you'll never guess what? I met one of our sisters that met the queen, and look, she gave me this, the queen's smell. And I'm like, wow, I can't believe you met somebody who actually met the queen. And so they communicate with each other that way, through their mouths, in taste and smell. Okay? But let's get back to honey. So here they're passing nectar back and forth. You remember growing up, and even now, as adults, it's still important to chew our food. Okay? And when you think of one of your favorite meals, what happens in your mouth? Starts to water, and you get all that saliva. And so when you're chewing your food, you're mixing it with all of that saliva. And saliva has enzymes in it, which break down the food and help it digest. Honeybees do the same thing. When they pass it from one to the other, they actually work it in their mouths and add their own saliva to it, okay? So we've got bees barfing in each other's mouths. We've got stomach acid being added to the honey, to the nectar. And now we've got bee spit in there too, right? Sounds delicious, right? All good meals start with good ingredients. Okay. But it's their way of pre-digesting because they're just adding all of these enzymes that digest the sugars that are in there. All right. They don't have to have a sister to slurp up honey and add enzymes to it. I like to tell people about 60 to 70% of what happens in a hive is vomiting. If we look, I'm going to say easily 80% of these bees are either barfing up honey or slurping up honey that they're going to then barf out. Okay? And it sounds gross, but we're all adults here, so we can sort of talk about these things. All of these bees here, with their heads stuck in a cell of honeycomb, they're either slurping up some of that nectar honey or barfing it out. Okay? And I like to, the way you think about that is, that's them chewing. Each bee that goes in there is like, each bee is another 10 bites. They're pre-digesting that food. They're getting it so that it's nice and easy and won't give them stomach aches, basically. Okay? So here's a frame, and you can see it's all in this wax. So let's get back to our question. How does nectar become honey? And it really is mostly trophallaxis. That adds enzymes. But they also do manipulation, like I said, when they're chewing it. That chewing is a manipulation. And that actually kind of helps squeeze some of the water out, which all living things need water, so the bees may drink some of that water. But they also do evaporation. When you open up a hive this time of year especially, you'll hear this buzz sound. And it is bees flapping their wings really fast. And they're actually creating a current of air that goes through and it passes over the honey, and it does something what we call like evaporative cooling, which means it's pulling water out of that honey. So there's all these processes they use to get it to be this really concentrated sugar. And the reason honey tastes so sweet to us is because it's been pre-digested by the bees. So the bees take these big chunks of sugar that are really complex, and they chew them, and they chew them, and they break apart until they're tiny little nuggets of sugar, the smallest possible unit of sugar. And that means they can pack tons of sugar into it. So it's more than 80% sugar. So when we taste it, it's like a sweetness explosion. Right? When you bite into an apple, apples have a sweetness to it, but there's all kinds of fiber, the flesh of the apple. There's a lot of water. Like if you get a really good apple, it's a nice juicy apple. There's all kinds of water and all these other things that are diluting the sweetness, which is good because we don't want everything super sweet. Honey doesn't have any of that. Honey is basically straight up, pure, simple sugars, which are really easy for us to taste and digest. Also, really easy for bees to digest as well. Honey is one of the most efficient fuels, right? We call it an energy conversion ratio, which just means a bee can fly a lot further on a gram of honey than they can on a gram of sugar water. It's just there's more energy in it. So that's how they do it. And as you can see, bees spend a lot of time with their heads stuck in things, whether it's honeycomb or flowers, right? And when we're in the hive, this is what ripe honey looks like. Right? So let's go back one and just do a comparison. here, all of these honeycomb cells, all those hexagons are wide open. Okay? They're wide open because remember, one of the things they do is they evaporate that water out. So you have to have, like if you leave a pan of water out in the sun, what happens to it over time? It evaporates, it disappears. So it has to be open so that that water can get out. Once the water's out and the bees can test it, they're like, ooh, that tastes just about sweet enough. That's got the right water content. They then cover it up with wax. Where do they get the wax? Anybody have any ideas where they might get the wax? Joanne Fabrics? No. They make the wax themselves. So on their abdomens, they have these glands called wax glands. You'll never guess what wax glands make. More glands? No. They make wax. And so the wax will come out of those glands and other bees will scrape it off there and then they'll turn it into this thing that they cover the honey with. And I don't know about you, I'm going to tell you another story about my grandma, but growing up, my grandma and I she would teach me how to make strawberry jam. And once we had the sugar concentration and the jam was just right and ready to set, guess what we would do? We would take wax and pour it on the top to seal it, okay? And so she would use a lot of times paraffin wax, but you could use beeswax as well. And that's what the bees are doing. They're sealing, they've made these preserves, these sugary jam that we call honey, and they're just sealing it with a wax coating. And when you get a fresh frame of newly capped honey, it is one of the most beautiful things, just this pure white wax. So the last couple of days, I've been out, and this is what I've been doing. I've been stealing honey from I've been harvesting honey from all the hives, colonies that I manage. And I'm just seeing frame after frame like this. And it's just really, that fresh wax is so beautiful. Now, I want to talk about the wax because it's really, really important. So this is what we would call natural comb. If we let the bees, if we just told the bees, go ahead and make your comb any way you want, they would start to do this. Now this one, I have to be honest, you can see the heart in it.
Oh, yeah.
That was actually, you can actually get bees to make comb in different shapes by giving them like a little starter strip. So that's what this person did, is they did a little starter strip of wax in a heart shape. And so the bees were like, oh, once there's wax there, they're like, oh, clearly some bees have started making comb here, we're gonna finish. Now, if you look at this, look at all these, this is where the bees live, in between all of these different sheets of comb. And they're filling it with honey and stuff. Remember when I said it acts as an insulation? So imagine this is your house, and all of these are walls. It's just gonna keep the heat from escaping. So it just keeps all the heat trapped in there, and it helps the bees regulate the temperature in the colony a lot better. Bees actually have air conditioning. They do their own air conditioning. They've had it for millions of years. We had to wait until like what, 1910s or something like that to get air conditioning. And anyway, but the wax, as I mentioned, is made by the worker bees. And there's a question Greg asked earlier. It can take as much as 10 pounds of honey to produce a pound of wax. Luckily, wax is really strong the way the bees build it, so you don't need tons and tons. You don't need a whole lot of weight of wax necessarily. And wax is really taxing. So it's one of the things that it can actually, making a lot of wax can shorten up the individual honeybee's life because it's such a taxing process. Just think of like any jobs that people do. You know, if you're a construction worker digging ditches, you're gonna wear down a lot quicker than somebody sitting at a desk not digging ditches, right? Okay. So I want to talk about real quick, because this is about. I'm just gonna get all these up here. Okay. The way we used to, way back, even basically in the 1800s and before, the way we used to harvest honey is very, very different from how we do it now. Oftentimes, the colonies just produce natural comb. They produce their own comb. And you would go in, and many times you'd have to kill the whole colony to harvest the honey. Or you could harvest some of the honey and you'd still be doing some damage. It'd be like cutting a couple limbs off of a tree. Okay? But the colony could still survive that. Now, we have built hives with something called removable frames so that we don't have to destroy the colony. We can take those frames out. Let me go back to show you. Okay, oops. So this is part of a frame. I'm going to show you this here as well, and we'll pass this around in a minute. We put these frames in the hive. And that means instead of making all those wavy lines, we get a nice straight line of comb that we can pull out of the hive. We don't have to cut and destroy any of the colony. And then I can take this off and I can go extract it. I can drain all the honey out of this once it's full. And then I can return it to the colony. Now I've stolen all of their honey, but I'm returning the comb, the wax. And because that's such a difficult thing for them to make, it's a real big advantage. Not only is it healthier for the bees because they don't have to deal with me cutting out a big section of comb, but now they don't have to make more wax. And that means, remember, 10 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax, all of a sudden my bees can make a lot more honey. So it's good for the bees in that I'm not destroying the colony. I am still stealing their honey, but because I'm not destroying the comb, they can make even more honey, which means there's plenty of honey for the bees and plenty of honey for me, right? So all in all, this is a good thing. Oops. There we go.
Oh boy.
So this is literally how I harvest the honey. I take my hand and I pull the frames out and then I brush the bees off. And I don't know if anybody saw, but I was actually out back yesterday afternoon doing just that. My wife came and helped me and we were just stealing the honey and brushing it off. Normally I don't harvest this time of year necessarily. And I'm not doing a full harvest at the moment. What happens is, I was telling Greg on the way in, is the colonies are getting honey bound. And what that means is there are so many flowers and so many trees in bloom right now that there is just, it's like an open bar out there, right? And the bees can get all the nectar they can drink. And that means that they're putting nectar into the colony and there's no room for the queen to lay eggs. And there's barely room for them to put more pollen and other things. And so I'm going in there and I'm going to extract some of that honey and then I'll give them back comb that's already made and now the queen can lay eggs. Because if the queen doesn't lay eggs, you don't get new bees. And if you don't get new bees, your colony ends up dying off. So being honey bound is what I like to call a good problem to have. It's better than the colony starving. But anyway, I had to go out, pull some of the frames out. We're going to empty it. Now I want to talk about, I'm going to pass this around. I put a big piece of plastic in there. And if you know anything about bees and history, you know that 1 million years ago, bees were making honey, but plastic hadn't been invented, right? So why are we putting this plastic in here? This plastic helps. Honeycomb, honey wax is very fragile. It's very strong within the colony, but when you take it and start moving it around, it's very fragile. So we put this plastic in here so that when I extract the honey, I don't destroy the comb. It's like a good support system. Okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and just pass that around. You guys can get a feel of that. And you'll notice that we even stamped little, yes, thank you very much. There's even little hexagon patterns stamped in there. The bees don't need that plastic foundation or that pattern, but we do that because that's me asking the bees, would you make your comb in a nice, straight, easy to steal formation for me instead of that crazy looking heart shape, right? Which is much harder to do. I'm gonna Once that one's done around, or if I could ask you to help take one around. This one is one I took out of one of the hives yesterday because I wanted to bring it in. And you can see they've started building the wax on it. They haven't finished it. Go ahead and have a look at that. If it gets smashed, it's fine. But you can kind of feel that wax, get a feel for what it feels like. If we smash it, they'll fix it back up. They can work it and repair it really good. Yeah. If we do, thank you so much. I appreciate it. If we give them, there's some hives that there's so much honey coming in. I have given some of my colonies 8 of these all at one time, and they turned it into 8 of these filled with ripe honey in less than 3 weeks. So that means when they're putting on, it's maybe a quarter of a pound of honey, or I'm sorry, maybe a quarter of a pound of wax on each frame. So every 4 frames requires 10 pounds of honey. So it took them 20 pounds of honey to make that. That's just how much honey, how many trees are in bloom and everything right now. Okay? And this time of year, that can happen from time to time. So this is a friend of mine. I do get a lot of help from my wife and other friends who help with harvesting the honey. I do take people out to the hives sometimes to harvest honey. We'll be doing a honey harvest here as well. But we go out, there's all kinds of other ways to harvest the honey. I like to do it by hand. But there are other ways that, especially if you're a beekeeper who has 1,000 hives and you have to harvest them, you would never get finished doing it by hand. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, sir.
But this is how I like to do it. I like to not get too big because this means I get to spend more time with my bees and I get to understand what the colonies are doing and what their needs might be. Because at the end of the day, my job isn't stealing honey from bees. My job is to take care of the bees, to make sure they're healthy and happy, and that way they'll make honey that I can steal, right? So in order to be able to steal the honey, I have to make sure I'm taking care of the bees. And I also have to make sure not to steal too much, because if I steal too much honey, they won't have enough to survive the winter, and then I don't have any bees, right? So I know I joke about stealing the honey from them, but I'm working with them. I'm working with the bees. I'm seeing how much honey can they make, how much honey do I think they're going to need. And there are times of the year where maybe I took a little bit too much honey in the summer, so I might feed them a little supplemental feed in the winter. Okay? I try to avoid that because that's more work. And anything that I can feed bees is never going to be as good for them as honey, right? But that's my primary job, is not stealing honey, right? That's why I'm called a beekeeper and not a honeyman, right? Because I'm supposed to keep the bees. And they have told me time and time again, here's what I'm supposed to keep them: happy, healthy, and well-fed, right? So that's my job, all right. But let's go back to, because we all like honey, right? Well, thank you. We all like honey, and we are going to do some extraction. So in the last couple of minutes here, I want to go through what the extraction process really looks like. And then next month, we get to do that here. Okay?
Yeah, baby.
So, who can tell me, when they put the wax over the honey like that, what does that mean? What does it mean for the honey? Remember?
It's ready.
It's ready. When my grandma and I made the strawberry jam, once it was ready to set up, we pour wax on it, right? So once this is ready, pour wax on it. So number one step, I check the hives to see when the honey is capped. Number 2 step, I take those cappings off. The bees did all that work to put that wax on there to make sure it was perfect. But again, think about it. When I make that strawberry jam with my grandma, we put the wax on top of it to seal it and keep it fresh. What's the whole point of doing that? So that later I can take the wax off and have some strawberry jam, right?
Now, what do you do with this wax that's coming off with the honey in it?
Yeah.
Anything?
So we use a hot knife to pull off the wax here. You can see it's really, really super thin amount of wax. So it doesn't weigh much. I end up, once I get all the honey off of that wax, I'll do things like make candles out of it, or I'll use it to make lip balm. I also use it actually to give back to the bees, some of it. So I raise queens, and so I make little cells out of beeswax to help raise new queens in. And again, when you look at that thin coating compared to all the wax that's on this, that's left on this, you know, I'm leaving something like 80% of the wax. Okay. So it's still way better for bees than taking the whole comb. So we use a hot knife to get that off, and now it's open. And then we get a bunch of fancy equipment, which we'll bring one of these here. It's called an extractor or a centrifuge. Okay. It's just a big container, and on the inside, we put our frames in it, right? So here's our frames of honey, and we just take them, put them in like that. So what happens is our frames of honey are sitting in the extractor. You'll see, you guys will see this in July. Actually, you'll get to do this in July. Put them in there, and when these spin, the honey comes out. Okay? Because if I were to just hold this, like if I were to hold this bottle of water, open the lid, and start turning around, I'd never be invited back, one. But two, that water would go flying out everywhere, right? That's all we're doing here. We're just spinning that around, but we're doing it inside of a container that has a hole in the bottom that then lets the honey come out. Okay? And so now we've got it. And what are those bits in there? Those are probably little bits of wax that when you take the cappings off, little bits of wax fall back on the honey and stuff. So we usually run it through a strainer to get any little bits and pieces out of it. And then whenever possible, I get child labor to do most of my work. I have another big piece of equipment that's called a bottler that we then pour the honey into, and then I can fill bottles. That's how it's people that way. And so this was a festival that I was working at one time, and we just set up the bottler so people could fill up their own bottles. What's that?
Can I get some chapstick?
If I remember, I'll bring some beeswax next time. A lot of time, so that's a good question because people ask me what I make, and it's chapstick and all that. I also make little balms of coconut oil, beeswax, and shea butter. And you can just use as sort of like a hand rub, or you could use it as a chapstick.
We'll buy some of those and give them away.
But those are kind of, it can be a real simple recipe. Other people make lip chapsticks that are a lot more, I don't want to say complicated, but they're not just 3 simple ingredients. But I work in the bees barehanded a lot of times. And I've even still got stains because there's lots of sticky stuff in the colonies. But you wouldn't know that my job was to be a manual laborer because I have soft, lovely hands because they're covered in beeswax every day, right? So, you know, most of the time you're like, oh, I can tell you work, and you use a hammer because your hands are calloused and stuff. Not beekeepers. We work hard, but, you know, self-care. We work hard, but we're fabulous. One quick note, and then we're gonna wrap up here because we're coming close to the end of our time. So these are different samples of honey. These are all honeys from the same hives in the same location. Wow. And what this is, starting over here, early spring honey, late fall honey. The difference is, what's the difference between spring and fall?
Foliage.
Foliage, the types of plants, the weather, but most importantly, what plants are blooming. Like in the fall, there's lots here, so I'm going to speak about Ohio, there's lots of goldenrod, thistle. In the spring, apple trees, black locust trees, dandelions, that kind of thing. So It's the nectar, that raw material, that determines the color and taste of honey. So honey tastes different throughout the year.
So they actually extract nectar from dandelions?
Yes.
I didn't know that. I always hated dandelions.
You know, dandelions are a big, so interestingly, because I'm working on an article actually about dandelions, so I'll go on a little tangent here. Dandelions, most people here hate them. Gosh, these dandelions are horrible weeds. North and South America never had any dandelions until we showed up. And we brought them over. They were a food plant.
Really?
In Europe.
Yeah,
And
right.
people were like, there's no dandelions here. How am I going to have my dandelion
Salad.
stroganoff
Yeah.
or whatever? I don't know what you make with dandelion salad. Yeah, dandelion
Yeah,
salad.
my grandmother-in-law used to make dandelion salad.
Yeah.
She would go out in the yard and pick all the leaves and
Yeah,
we would eat it.
my Aunt Alice actually would do that as well. The root of the dandelion is also edible. So it's not quite like a carrot, but you can also make tea out of it. Anyway, colonists brought the dandelions over. They also brought the honeybees over. Honeybees are not native to North America. They're actually from Europe and Africa. And so both of them are imports. Apple trees as well. They're brought over. They weren't here originally.
You're telling me there was no indigenous bees here in
No indigenous honeybees.
honeybees?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
There's
struggling with that.
all kinds of, there are something like 4,000 species of bee in the US, in the North America, I'm sorry. Most of those are native.
Okay.
There's a handful like honeybees, wool carder bees, a couple others that are introduced. But they're solitary bees that mostly live in deserts. But honeybees and apple trees both came from Europe and Asia. And so when we first brought apple trees over, the apple trees didn't really do that great. They weren't producing lots of apples. And they finally realized it's because there's no honeybees. Not that the solitary bees don't pollinate, they just have never seen an apple tree. When they came over, they're like, we've never seen this apple tree.
I know when I bought my first hive, it was an Italian
Queen, yeah.
Italian queen.
Yep. And then I use Carniolan and Caucasian queens, both of which, again, are from the Bosnia-Herzegovina area and the Republic of Georgia. And so, yeah, the honeybees we domesticate are the Western honeybee, mostly from Europe, and there's a couple of species in Africa that are domesticated as well.
Sure. Amazing.
Now, I want to end up with, because that's all great, yay, honey's delicious, we all love it. We don't care that it's just a bunch of bee barf, pre-digested, right? We don't care because it's sweet and delicious. Just like we love our kids, because even though we know they're disgusting, horrible teenagers, we still love them. Right, Dave? Yes, Dave, we love them. But let's talk about what honey is actually for. And it's for the bees. It's their main source of energy. It's their food. More importantly, I'm using big words. Homeostatic thermoregulation. Honeybees in particular need to survive through the winter. And notoriously, there aren't any flowers blooming in the winter in Ohio. And honeybees need to do something called homeostatic thermoregulation. What that means is they need to keep their temperature constant, okay? Just like us, right? We all have a body temperature. In fact, doctors often, when we go in for a checkup, they check your temperature.
Yep.
And if your temperature isn't consistently the same, that means there's a problem, okay? Same with honeybees. They need to keep their temperature the same throughout the year. I have a thermal camera. So it's a camera that just picks up heat. And I go out and I spy on my bees in the winter. This is what they look like inside the colonies. So this is the hottest part.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And this is, anybody guess what this is on top of this colony?
Snow.
No.
Yeah. There's snow on it. Even in the coldest part of winter with snow on top of the colony, the bees in here are a nice warm 98 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the colony.
You know what's interesting is they're generating enough heat that it's actually heating the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of reflected. Yep. And even in here, if you go out, you can see more what we would call heat shadows. The heat is actually really pouring out. In the early spring, when I go in the hives, you can open the hive and put your hand on the top of it, and you can feel the heat coming up, like it were a vent, a heating vent. So what does this have to do with honey? What happens when you give a young kid sugar? They get hyper, lots and lots of energy. What is honey? Sugar. Sugar. It's just energy. So I want everyone to do a little experiment with me here in a minute. Honeybees use that sugar to give themselves energy, and they convert that energy into heat. And they do it with their flight muscles, and I'm going to show you how they do it. Everybody get your hands out. Okay, put them together. Now, while you're pushing them together, rub as fast as you can. Push and rub, push and rub. And what's happening to the palms of your hands?
Warm.
They're getting warm.
Heating up.
They're heating up. So, you know that there's like that old picture where you're standing by a fire, warming up your hands. That's what honeybees are doing all year long. They eat some honey, and then they vibrate their flight muscles. Their whole, let me bring up one more picture, sorry about that. And then we're, okay. So you see this honeybee here where her wings attach? This thorax right here, that is just full of muscles. Because in order to fly, you have to have really strong muscles that can really move those wings super fast, right? Because when a honeybee or any kind of insect is flying, the wings are moving so fast you can't even see them. It's just a blur. And so what they do is, when they fly, they contract those muscles. So it's like doing this. In the winter, when it's cold, they don't contract the muscles, they vibrate them. And it creates heat. So see the difference? I can do work this way or this way with the same hand. And it's the same with bees. So that's why when I say I'm a beekeeper and I joke a little bit about stealing honey, I'm also making sure that I'm managing them and keeping them healthy and well fed. Because if they don't have enough honey to get through the winter, oh, sorry about that. If they don't have enough honey to get through winter, they can't generate that heat that will keep them alive through the coldest part of the winter. Okay. The trickiest time for beekeepers is usually right when winter's ending, because that's when the honeybees' food resources are at their absolute lowest. And so a lot of times, end of February, when we're just getting ready for spring, and the dandelions haven't quite yet bloomed or anything like that, I often might go give them a little extra food. I might give them a little bit of sugar. Not the best food for them, but it's sort of like, well, this will hold you over until you can get a good meal, right? But ideally, I don't have to do that. They should still have enough honey. And I use this camera to see, like for example, this was I think late February. Well, the bees are already at the top. And I happen to know they started down here, which means they've eaten their way through all their honey reserves. So I can use my camera to tell me those bees probably need some food. So that is how honey is made. There was a little bit in there about how we extract it, but we extract it in a way that we're not taking too much from the bees of either honey or wax, because wax is very valuable. But we do get a little bit of wax. Oh gosh. I'm trying to think, I should really do the math on this, but for every 100 pounds of honey that I extract, I maybe harvest a pound or two of wax.
Of what?
Wax, beeswax, when I cut the cappings off. But that's much different than the 10 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of wax, right? So I'm not taking very much wax at all. It's much less of an impact. And we call it the modern hive, like it's this brand new thing. And it was actually patented in 1851. So
1851.
that is that's how far, in this world where
170 years old.
Yeah.
The science behind beekeeping.
Yeah, and it really, there's been little incremental things, but the basic design of the hive the secret is in these frames and how there's a little space in between them, okay? And it was watching the bees and realizing that was the space that they needed in between the frames in order to make honey. So
And that's
unlike
not
our,
changed over 170 years.
it really, this basic setup hasn't changed at all.
Wow.
No. You can do, I mean, they can change things like from 10 frame to 8 frame, there's all
Sure,
kinds
yeah.
of different variations on this, but it's the same thing. And it's so, it's not like most other things in our life these days where cars today are nothing like they were 5 years ago either, right? So half of them are running on electric batteries.
Yeah.
Our phones, you know, if you have a cell phone that's more than 3 years old, I'm not sure you can actually call people on that anymore. I don't know.
It's a stone age.
But our understanding of bees, the modern hive is, 170 years old.
Wow.
And but it was such a good design, and it helps the bees so much. It's really using the modern hive instead of just cutting comb out of the colony. Really, it more than doubles the honey yields, the honey crop they can produce. So I'm going to end with this because we are talking about taking honey, and we are going to take some honey and harvest it. But we want to make sure everybody thinks it's all super. Wait, there we go. The bees are really super amazing, and they know how to do these little holes and stuff, and these perfect hexagon shapes. And how do they know how to do it? I spend a lot of time with bees, and I don't like to tell them that humans think that they're wonderful, magical little rainbow creatures that make honey, because I see. So see all these hexagons here? 6-sided. What's that? Right there. One, a pentagon. Oh, yeah. So when you get to know bees, you get to understand that they're not always perfect. Right? Just like us. As you get to, when you get to know people and you become friends with them, part of becoming friends with them is because you realize they're no more perfect than I am, right? And it's the same with bees. You can see there's some really, this is like, I don't know what that is, 4 or 5. Anyway, there's some really messed up ones in there. But that's normal. In a beehive making natural comb, that kind of, those little mistakes are normal because you got 60,000 bees all trying to do one construction project. So mistakes are going to be made. And, but I also like to make the thing I'll end on is making the analogy to sheep. So this modern hive design that's 170 years old has increased yields, the amount of honey that one honeybee colony can make, almost by triple. And we actually have to take some of that honey off because it's not good for the bees to have that much honey, which they could never eat. In 5 years, they couldn't eat the honey they produce in a year. It's like sheep, right? If you see sheep, they get all woolly and big and fat with wool, and then we have to shear it off so that we can make clothes and stuff. But sheep naturally don't grow that much wool. We bred them and give them technology so they'll grow more wool. What do you think would happen in August to a sheep if we didn't cut the wool off of it? It'd probably die of heat exhaustion. Okay. So honey is similar. We do have to harvest it actually to keep the hives healthy because we've bred bees to produce more honey, and then we've given them this technology of the modern hive that increases their honey production even more. So for honeybees, we can't just sort of let them live their life in nature because we've done so much breeding to them that it wouldn't be great for them. Unlike things like bumblebees and other bees, which we need to just kind of leave alone because they're living in nature and doing things just fine, and we haven't interfered with them yet. So with that, if there's any other last questions, I'm happy to take questions. And then from there, I'm going to work with Greg and make sure that we set up our own honey extraction, because who here would like to actually see us take some of those full ripe grains of honey and spin them out right into jars that we could taste?
I would like to see it.
Yes. So we are going to do that. And then you had a question in the back.
Yes, what time of the year is the sweetest honey you produce?
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm not sure there is. So the sweetness of honey.
Favorite?
My favorite's this early spring honey. And it's a really light color. It almost looks like water when it comes out of the comb. In July, we should still see some of that, and it gets darker. I think in the spring, it's not a matter of sweetness. I'm sure you could actually find that some honeys are sweeter than others. But it depends on the plants that they collect from. And in the fall, the nectar in those plants just has more stuff in it, more stuff that's not sugar or water. And that's what changes the color, and it gives it a really stronger flavor.
Yeah.
The early spring honey, I think, tastes more, it's a sweetness, but it's sort of this light, almost like smelling a flower taste. Whereas the late stuff in the honey, you're like, oh, that's, you know, the late fall, that's honey. Yeah, so it's really strange. So hopefully we'll be able to, I should bring in a sample of my buckwheat honey as well for tasting.
Yeah.
So buckwheat is a plant that produces prolific amounts of nectar, but the honey, if I go back to this picture, this is buckwheat honey.
Oh, you can't even see through it?
Yeah, it's
Wow.
really dark, and it almost tastes like molasses. There's a lot, you either love buckwheat honey or you don't.
Yeah.
And I'll try to bring some of that, so you can get a taste of how these different things. Here in Ohio, our biggest issue is we can't do things necessarily like clover honey or alfalfa honey or things that you might see in the grocery store, because we don't have 10,000 acres of clover for the bees to feed on. There is clover honey in the honey that we make in Ohio, but it's clover, dandelion, apple tree. It's just so many different, we just end up calling it wildflower honey.
Yeah.
Which is our way of saying we don't know what all the bees put in there. Things like clover honey are made in pollination services. So big farms, most of them up in North Dakota, producing clover seed to sell to farmers who make hay and different things. They bring honeybees in to pollinate that clover. And because it is like 5,000 to 10,000 acres at a time, they're pretty sure that 90% of the nectar is coming from clover. So you can call it clover honey. And I mentioned that because there are some honeys. There's like a Tupelo honey, which is like from the Florida Panhandle. It's a tree. And a lot of people say that that's a sweeter honey. There's a leatherwood honey from Australia. You've probably heard of Manuka honey. So all these different honeys have different sort of flavor profiles and sweetness
I
levels.
never knew there was so much honey.
Yeah, yeah.
But they do say that honey, local honey is better for you to help with allergies and those types of things just because of that. You have all this mix of flowers and different things that are going on that cause allergies. And if you're eating local honey, that tends to be good for your body because it tends to digest that and get used to whatever those things
And some of
are.
the honey actually has, so remember when I was saying pollen is the protein source that they use to feed their larva babies? Pollen is not used in making honey, but there is pollen in honey because bees come in covered in pollen and bees are messy. So when you have that big open frame of honey, pictures always. So when the honey over here is ripening, and you've got bees walking all over it, and they're covered in pollen, pollen's dropping into the honey. So pollen isn't an ingredient of honey, it's a contaminant, if you want to think of it that way. But it's not like it's like, strawberries on ice cream. Well, strawberries aren't ice cream, they're a contaminant, but we're okay with that. Right?
Delicious.
Right. And so the pollen in the honey actually, it's what they call the hygiene theory, I think. When you expose yourself to allergens, you help suppress your allergic reaction. So that's kind of the idea behind eating local honey, is that bee barf plus pollen equals better allergies. So, any other questions before we wrap up today? Yeah.
My friend keeps these,
Mhm.
and she gave me a jar from Honeybee. And it was all like cloudy, like it wasn't clear honey like at grocery store. So what makes it different?
That's a great question, because we'll probably see that when we extract. I'm getting ready to do an extraction now, and I'm kind of curious to see how clear or not it is. It really comes down to, last year at the end of the year, I had some honey. I can't get it to be clear no matter what I do, because sometimes it's just there's so much pollen in it. So there can be a lot of pollen in the honey and it makes it cloudy. And what happens is when you have a little tiny grain of pollen, I'm just gonna go off on tangents if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'm happy to answer more and more questions. How many of you as a kid made rock candy, where you make this really thick sugar syrup and you hang a string down in it, and then sugar crystals grow on that string? Okay. But that's the same principle as that cloudy honey. It's got all this pollen in it, which makes it so you can't see through it. But that little bit of pollen, the sugars in that honey are going to start to crystallize around it. So that honey you got, if you let it sit on the shelf for a month or two, it will turn into solid sugar. It'll crystallize, not spoiled, perfectly usable. And there's two ways you can use it. You can just scoop it out and eat it. It's kind of gritty, sandy. Or you can put it in some gentle heat. What I like to do is, especially if it's a glass jar, put it in the oven and turn the oven light on. And remember when I said honeybees keep their colony at 98 degrees? Well, guess what happens? In the colonies, their honey crystallizes too. But when the bees move up onto it and they warm that honey up to 98 degrees, it turns back into liquid. And so you can do that. Another quick way to do it, if it does crystallize, get a pot of water and get it to boil, take it off the heat, and then just put the honey in it. And that passive heat should liquefy it again. So the bottling tank that I mentioned earlier, I'll pour a lot of the honey in that, and it's actually a heated tank. So I can adjust the heat to about 90 degrees. And then I do something, it's called letting the honey settle. So during that heat process, some of the impurities, some of the things that aren't honey sort of float up to the top. And that way when I bottle it, it's a little bit more clear. And then sometimes I'll put it at another heat. But I always heat it at 100 degrees or less, because that's the temperature that the honeybees make it at and store it at. So I figure that the honeybees know what they're doing. So I just follow their lead. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Yes.
Beekeeper Dave. Right here, Dave. Just so you know, I used to spend every Saturday with Dave for 3 hours. So we have so much content that we could go on for hours and hours and hours. But I've always been so fascinated with beekeeping and what bees do for us, honeybees do for us, and the types of fruits and vegetables we're able to eat. And so thank you, Dave, for sharing. And remember to come back next month, because we're going to be eating bee bark.
Yes.
You don't want to miss that. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Bee bark.
Bee bark.
That's what honey is.
Also known as
Honey is bee bark.
honey bar.
Bee bark, like. But you love honey, don't you?
Yeah, but I don't like.
The concept, I know.
I don't like what you call it. Right, I'm with you. I don't like what you call it. I mean, it's true, but it's just.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Very informational.
But yeah, real quick.
Yeah.
Let me get this
I got
thing.
it in there. I did what you said. I just chased them out.
Good, good.